The bit of the title following the colon is in some sense very easy to answer, in another sense extremely difficult. Difficult because it requires you to move away from the idea of poverty to richness or riches. And I'll come to that as well. Okay? At one level, of course, the answer must be yes. The poorest on earth live on natural capital, directly on natural capital. We all do, but we buy it from elsewhere. Trade allows us to do that. But the poorest live directly on it. So, in some sense, husbanding that is the prerequisite for their livelihood. That's the simple part of the answer. The harder one is that you don't want them to remain poor. You want to raise their standards. And the question arises whether that can be done in a sustainable way, taking a horizon of 100, 200, 300 years as minimum. Okay? And there things become more difficult, but it will give some orders of magnitude. Some people have estimated that if the 5.7 billion people in poor and middle-income countries were to lift their standard of living up to the average of the remaining 1.3 billion, then we'd need 2 or 3 Earths. So that kind of calculation, estimation, suggests that the question should rather be, can we afford to eat as much as we do in the West? And I want to come to that class of issues. The issue isn't simply a matter of morality, because it's my belief versus your belief, or my value versus your value. The area where we economists can be of use to the rest of us is in understanding, trying to understand pathways which get missed in economic estimations and the numbers that we read. We typically use the expression externalities to describe that phenomenon, that things are happening out there which are unrecorded. And that's the right way to think about externalities. Externalities are the unrecorded consequences to others of actions that we undertake, any of us undertakes. The recorded bits, something can be done about them. It's the unrecorded parts which are hard. And I want to spend quite a bit of time, the time I have, discussing illustrations, giving you illustrations of it, because in economics textbooks, you would think externalities are the rarity. They crop up as the final chapter, and then there are externalities, having gone through 24 chapters on the virtues of market processes. But if you've worked on this kind of problem, on green issues, as long as I have, all you see are externalities. There aren't very much left, so to speak. So I'm sort of obsessed with the externalities, and the trick is to try and unearth them wherever you can. And that has led me into various terrains, including demographic matters. Because one aspect of an answer to the question whether poverty can be in a sustainable way removed from Earth involves our scrutiny of the size of the human population. That's a subject which we economists on the whole like to ignore, because there are other things we can think about: technological progress, accumulation of capital, better management of resources, and so forth. But in reproductive decisions that we all engage in, there are pervasive externalities there too. And there are externalities associated with consumption, which is something that I want to talk about as well. Now, when one talks about externalities, the picture one has, of course, is typically the commons problem. That's familiar to all of you. So I'll actually not speak too much on that, because you understand the nature of the externality there, common pool. To children, if they're given a large bottle of, or small bottle for that matter, of Coke, and you give each of them a straw and ask them to drink out of the same bottle, you will find, in a controlled experiment, if you conduct it, you will find that they will have consumed it faster than they would have if each had been given a separate bottle, half of the size. And that's the commons problem. You the strategically advantageous action is to speed up your consumption because of lack of property rights there. Commons are an example of what we call reciprocal externalities. Each is inflicting a damage, if you like, in the commons case, on others. It doesn't have to be symmetric. Classroom exercises typically are symmetric ones, where everybody's equal. They help us to solve that problem. That assumption helps us to solve the problem in a neat way. But the idea is that it's pervasive. Each inflicts, to a larger or smaller extent, an effect on others. Of course, you can have externalities which are beneficial. The standard arguments concerning public goods is the flip side of it. But in this case, we are concerned, the ones we are concerned with here are these externalities which are harmful ones. The kind of externalities which has been studied far less have been unidirectional ones. Unidirectional ones are just that, unidirectional. The consequences are one-sided. The action is taken by A, the effect is on B, the unrecorded effect is on B. Now, why am I discussing this here? The reason is, of course, it has a lot to do with valuation. It's right at the heart of valuation exercises. Georgina and I were discussing at lunch the ways of valuation, and it is, to me, something I've got into some trouble with my colleagues in the United States, friends of mine, most of whom are very close friends of mine, but we don't necessarily see matters the same way, is that for 30 years in the United States, largely, I think, under the influence of the EPA, which is, of course, a very important and useful institution, has seen, for 30 years or so, valuation experts in the United States have seen natural capital or nature as an amenity. Beaches, fishing, snorkeling, that sort of thing. So it was very natural thinking of those as something like potentially competitive but essentially public goods. So it's very natural then to ask people how they value this stuff. So very, very subtle methods have been devised, contingent valuation techniques, hedonic prices of real estate. A house which overlooks a slum is valued at less than a house which looks over a beach. Other things being equal, the latter house will be valued higher, and the differential prices could be used to judge the worthwhileness of that scene. The kind of features of natural capital that we are interested in here, and has always concerned me, has been nature as a means of production. And that includes, of course, survival, source of food, source of fiber, and so forth and so on, which the MEA, as you well know, did so much to publicize. And there, these externalities are, you can't arrive at them by simply asking people how they value the stuff. They may not even know the underlying processes involved. Here's an example, and that will lead me to the notion of wealth. Imagine a forest in the uplands of a country, and that's not very hard to imagine. Indonesia comes to mind immediately, as does Malaysia. It's reading about those countries in the newspaper which led me to start working in this field some 30 years ago. The forest has hardwood, so can be exported. And today, of course, there's a hungry set of importing countries, mine being one, China is another, are in need of hardwood. So logging takes place. Let's imagine, ignore corruption and so forth. Imagine all that's very clean. A logging firm has been given the right to fell trees from this forest, which is then, the timber is then exported. Other things being equal, imagine that the market is fine, or put it this way, the FOB price is non-negotiable because China can get hardwood from elsewhere too. So it's a constant price, a fixed price that the exporting country faces. So the FOB price will be the value of the timber. FOB means the price at the border. But of course, we know of the various other services the forest offers, among which are benefits that farmers downstream and fishermen downstream enjoy for obvious reasons that are familiar to you, so I won't belabor it. Now, is it not possible then to estimate the losses that the farmers would incur or would incur on account of deforestation? If you can, then you could work out the value that should be added to the FOB price. The social price of the export would be higher than the price at which it is sold. Now, interestingly, of course, you can see that this example is one where unless compensation is paid to the farmers, which I'll be assuming is not, and for good political reasons, political economy reasons, which has not very much to do with corruption, by the way. If you have thousands and thousands of farmers, and remember, these damages are site-specific, so it's not the case that all farmers are equally affected. So you've got a huge research potential here of figuring out what the total losses are and how to allocate the losses among the farmers. The farmers may not even know that they're being harmed. They're 200 miles, 300 miles away from the source of the externality. So it's not just pure corruption or anything. Just ignore all that. There is a basic problem in the nature of this, which only those in the know are in a position to study. The consequence, of course, is that in the absence of any compensation, the exporting country is losing wealth, because a part of the wealth is going to the importing country. And who is subsidizing that transfer? It's among the poorest people in the country, potentially amongst the poorest people in the country. This is a neat example because it has been taken up, since I wrote about it, by a very fine econometrician, Subrendu Patnaik, who is now a professor at Duke, and he actually tried to estimate it. This is hard work because it involves understanding the processes by which forest cover protect downstream farmers from soil erosion, water runoff, and so forth. So it requires soil experts, it requires hydrologists, it requires, of course, economists. We are indispensable, as you know, and so on. But it can be done. It's hard work. It takes years to publish one paper, and it's full of errors, of course, inevitably. Goes without saying. But you begin to get a ballpark figure. He worked out to be the losses being about 10% of the profits of farmers downstream. Another problem that besets us in this room is that all these studies are inevitably going to be site-specific. One of the world's great theoretical physicists, Steven Weinberg, once wrote, and it made a huge, it had an effect on me in the sense I realized how much harder my subject was to his, he said that once you've seen an electron, you've seen them all. Because the electron here is the same as the electron in Zambia, the same as the electron in Ethiopia, and so forth. But of course, this is not true. In our kind of stuff, our units that we study are going to be site-specific, slope-specific, which direction it faces, whether it's facing the east or the west, and so forth, and so on. Nevertheless, we have to get on with it. It's going to mean that there is no end, and since you finance research, you can have indefinite tenure at your job because there'll be never any lack of demand for money to do this kind of research. But it has to be done. We're about 40 years late because the questionnaire-based approach to evaluation has very limited usefulness for the kinds of problems that we are studying here. It would be a pathetic thing to ask the farmers downstream, how much are you willing to pay for reduction of deforestation, of logging upstream? They wouldn't know what the question was. even. Right. But these valuation exercises need to be done because they reflect the trade-offs that you were talking about earlier. And I want to spend the next 15 minutes, the second half of my talk, on that. Green growth. The right question, of course, is growth in what? If you the first cut into the question would be that what economists miss, or what normal national accounts miss, is the fact that natural capital can be degraded, easily degradable. They're potentially renewable. I'm not now talking about subsoil resources. I'm thinking about ecosystems. Let's think of them as they are renewable. They're naturally regenerative, but they can be destroyed if the rate at which you harvest from it or encroach upon it exceeds its assimilative capacity. They differ in their texture, of course, goes without saying. A fishery is different from a forest, and a forest is different from a lake, and so forth. But the art of good theorizing is to see the commonality of these models rather than see how distinct they are. Once you see the commonality, it doesn't take very much to distinguish their unique properties. I don't mean parameter values. I mean the way you should model it, whether you should model them in isolation, whether it behoves you to link the resource up or the unit up with some other resources and so forth. It's really a matter of detail. So the natural first step would be to say, well, there's something gravely wrong about the indicators we use to measure progress or regress of nations, e.g. GDP, because the rogue word in GDP is gross. Gross means doesn't take into account depreciation. So the natural thing then would be to say, well, why don't we study net domestic product, net of depreciation? And maybe we should look at the growth of that. Depreciation not only of physical capital, nor of human capital, and not only of human capital, i.e., for example, loss of memory or death, which is pretty dramatic. And that has to be taken into account, but natural capital too. And for a long while, about 20 years, a great many economists took it for granted that NDP is the indicator that we seek, those of us who care about these matters, like depreciation. I should just, as a footnote, I should say one reason I think depreciation didn't get much of a look in until we started making a noise about it is that economic models essentially looked at produced capital. Even human capital entered the scene about 20, 30 years ago, only 20, 30 years ago, not before. There were not very many good estimates of human capital. Of course, people knew humans are important and so forth. That goes without saying. Who doesn't regard himself or herself as being important? But the idea that this intangible stuff, named education, health, can be measured in some sense, or valued, is relatively new. And when it comes to produced capital, the depreciation methods are rather crude, but not exactly very deep stuff. You might say, well, typically any project producing produced capital will give you an indication of how long it's likely to last, 30 years, 50 years, and so forth. That will give you a sense of the rate at which it's depreciating, 3%, 4% or so. Since that's more or less the ballpark figure, people just ignored it. But of course, in natural capital, it's hugely endogenous. It could become 100%. Oil and natural gas depreciation will be 100% if when you use up one unit, it disappears, not to be seen again. And then in between are the various the other examples. So for a long while we thought, or people thought, that NDP would do the trick. The problem was I couldn't prove it. What couldn't I prove? One wants to ask what it is that we care about. And if it is human well-being across the generations, some indicator of intergenerational well-being, then it is that you're concerned with. And what you want is an indicator which is going to track the stuff that you really care about. Track in the sense that if one goes up, the other goes up. If one goes down, the other goes down, and vice versa. Okay? That's a theorem that was not provable, certainly not with NDP, and I tried it for quite a while, thinking that I was missing something rather elementary. The fact is, of course, there is no such theorem. The theorem that is correct, and which was proved by Karl-Johan Mailer at Stockholm and myself some 12 years ago, in its generality, is the indicator should be one of wealth. Wealth is a stock. Income is GDP, NDP, there's flows. And it is significant that the move is from flows to stocks, something that those of you who are not economists should find pleasing, because natural capital is a stock out there. All that stuff we care about, all the stuff that's doing so much for us, that's stocks. So we should measure the damn thing. We want to also see whether that stuff is going up or down over time, if you're concerned with sustainability issue. So now here's the theorem. The theorem says that you give me a notion of intergenerational well-being. It could be of any kind. Then there is a corresponding set of values that should be attached to all the forms of capital assets the economy possesses, produced, human and natural, such that if you construct a weighted sum of the stocks of these assets, the weights being these values, then that sum you call wealth will have the property that if wealth goes up, intergenerational well-being goes up, and vice versa. Okay, that's the equivalence theorem. Of course, being an equivalence theorem, it has no empirical content. It simply says instead of having to worry about intergenerational well-being, you should start thinking about how to value the stuff with the intergenerational well-being somewhere at the back of your mind, because you want to ensure that the values are reflecting that in the future, for example, and things that matter to society. And these values are these trade-offs between the various types of natural capital. And you can see why the process-based analysis that I started with is so important. It says that at the margin, the worth of a unit of natural capital will be very site-specific precisely because its functions are site-specific. It's affecting things out there. And mostly, you will not have market prices. You might say that can't be quite right, because after all, so many of these ecosystem services are provided on land. And if land market is reasonably good, we have this feeling that some people are thinking through these problems, so somehow the prices ought to reflect the worth of the land, which has all these ecosystems. So, for example, a land with a lot of hedges, such that birds are there, is likely to be valued higher than land without the hedges, because there aren't any birds, and if there aren't any birds, there can't be much pollination, and so forth. But again, of course, birds fly, deer flee, butterflies move as well. So they're a source, these mobile resources are a source of these externalities with which I began. And of course, there are regions where land markets are extremely stunted, Africa being one. So you can't really say that somehow these ecosystem services are being valued through the market system when the markets don't actually exist. So one has to, I think there is no way out than to do valuation exercises, recognizing that the processes need to be modeled, not just the ecological process, but the joint economic ecological systems. And we do have models of that kind now, simple ones. Very, very complicated ones aren't going to give you very many answers, like climate models have this problem. You don't know where the numbers are coming from because they're so huge. Simplification is very, very helpful. Aggregation is very, very helpful. And ecologists are masters at that. I've discovered when I started reading ecology properly, graduate textbooks, and talked to people like Paul Ehrlich and others. Many years ago, I realized that they were very natural economists. They really believed in simple models, two state variables, and they start sweating. One is about as much as they can handle. And that's very good. Okay, so now the question is, I've got about 2-3 minutes left, at best 5. I think you said 35, and I'll take that up because I've got 5 minutes left, to report on some attempts at estimating wealth. You might think that doing the theory, you get itchy fingers. You feel some numbers need to see how it works. So some years ago, I started doing that in conjunction with some very nice, very, very bold empirical work of this kind done at the World Bank by Kirk Hamilton and others. And I lifted some of their early figures and then did some further work. And I want to report in the next 4 minutes a paper that's recently just published 4 or 5 months ago in the Environment and Development Economics by Kenneth Arrow, Larry Gould, and myself, Kevin Mumford, and Kirsten Olsen. We looked at 5 countries, Brazil, China, India, United States, and Venezuela. Odd set, but partly different stages of development and partly difference in the resource base. Venezuela and Brazil were contrasting. One had a lot of trees, the other had a lot of oil, that sort of thing. And a lot of mismanagement, of course. But by the way, I should say that if you, I'm sorry, there is a question, maybe where do institutions come in? And institution as a capital and religion and so forth. Maybe we could discuss that at question time. Okay? They'll enter through the valuation. They're not separate capital assets. That's very important. And I'll explain why, but you'll have to ask. Okay? Okay. All right. So we did that. We looked at the period 1995-2000, looked at human capital, natural capital, and produced capital, of course. Let me work backwards in describing the results. They're pretty much the same. Venezuela is the one which has really been, it wasn't sustainable even with the first set of numbers we gave, largely because it's been eroding its natural capital base, the oil. It was so dependent on that, and it hadn't made up by furthering education and so forth, or health. In human capital, we looked at education, obviously, but there's been much work done on that, so it was a pretty simple exercise using the kinds of formulae that are now commonplace in the literature. I think where we were innovative was to introduce health as an aspect of human capital, which hadn't been done. And in health, we did something very constrained. We only looked at longevity. We did not look at the fact that if you have a headache, food tastes worse than if you don't have a headache, which is extremely important. But we missed that. And you'll be thankful that we did. On the other hand, and you'll see in a minute why, in natural capital, we had forests, but valued only for their timber. In other words, missing out precisely the kinds of things that I was harping on the first 15 minutes, because there are no data on that. That's why. Land, subsoil resources. Couldn't get data on fisheries. Stock figures are not available that easily. So here are the results. So we have a huge underestimate of the value of carbon. Of course, carbon was introduced too. And we used several prices, $50 to $100, $150 per ton, that range. So we did quite a bit of sensitivity analysis. But here's the basic result. Improvements in, if you study the wealth of nations, you estimate the wealth of nations, and you decompose it into its various types of capital, then the one which dominates surpasses all else by an order of magnitude is health. 95% of US wealth is in human capital in the form of health. Beats up on education every time, I mean, by a long shot, 95%. Okay, so there's only 5% left for all the highways, all the factories, and so forth. Will it persist, this kind of finding? The answer is no, because natural capital is hugely underestimated. I don't even have a ballpark figure of how much we are missing there. But what I can say is that if we're within hitting distance of what I think it's likely to be, then my guess is the wealth of nations really is composed of health and natural capital. The rest is pretty insignificant, relatively speaking, at the going rate. That doesn't mean that if all the highways are destroyed, highways won't become dominant. Remember, values are at the margin. So if you've got a lot of highways, then at the margin, the next highway is not valued very much. Okay? There are many other kinds of externalities which make for serious problems. Two have to do with consumption patterns. The Veblen effect is one, and conformist behavior is another, that we want to be like others. Both these kinds of externalities, these are not common property externalities, these are not the commons problem. These kinds of externalities lead to excessive consumption. But the moral is banal, that reduction of such consumption, if not done unilaterally, could be welfare enhancing, would be expected to be welfare enhancing. The problem arises that, of course, unilaterally no one wants to drop his or her consumption because that's the nature of externalities. We have very few economists working on these forms of externalities, the Veblen effect, the competitive consumption and the conformist consumptions, both of which can lead to excessive consumption. And the reason I want to end with that is that it's there, my guess is, where we are likely to find a solution to the problem of whether poverty can be removed through the accumulation of genuine wealth. It can't be removed if consumption externalities continue in the way they have. But the good news is if these externalities are significant, then we won't really lose in working towards a sustainable future.